Hello again, my fiber friends. I'm ReRe, and this is Exploration Crochet, part of the Yarn Over Hook network. Today, we're talking about a place. Close your eyes and imagine it. The smell is a mix of lanolin and cedar, maybe with a hint of Earl Grey. You hear the low hum of conversation, half ooze about colorways, half life updates. You see wooden cubbies, handwritten sample tags. You know someone will absolutely ask you what you're making. And somehow, although you went in for one skein, you leave with three, and maybe a new friend. That's not just retail. That's sanctuary. And today we're tracing the history of the modern local yarn shop, the LYS. We often describe them as small businesses, but as a crocheter, I see them as something older. Modern-day craft salons. They're classrooms, community centers, and keepers of oral tradition in a digital age. I can still remember the first time I walked into an actual yarn store. It was in 2019 in Denver, Colorado. I was on my lunch and I thought I'd poke around downtown for some yarn for a Christmas-themed project. A woman working at the downtown Target told me there was a yarn shop located someplace close by, and that's how I found it. The name was Yarn Shop Denver. The owner was there, a black woman. She was crocheting. She was incredibly helpful. She answered all the questions I had about yarn, even questions I didn't know I had. She told me about the Crochet Guild of America. She was president of the local chapter. And while I didn't find exactly what I was looking for, I walked out with some great hand-dyed yarn, which I used to make a hat. I also got a fancy wooden hook that I sent to my daughter, and if you've watched any of the early Yarn Over Hook tutorials on the YouTubes, you've seen it. But most importantly, I walked out with a new perspective, not only on the experience of purchasing yarn, but a perspective of what crochet community could be. Yarn shops didn't just appear fully formed with curated wall displays and indie-dyed merino. They evolved, and their story tells us something powerful about craft, about community, and about why physical spaces still matter. So how did we get from practical supply counters of the 19th century to the fiber tourism of multi-county yarn crawls? Grab your current whip, get comfortable, and let's dive in. For most of history, buying yarn wasn't an experience, it was a chore. In the 1800s, if you needed wool or thread, you went to a dry goods store, a general mercantile, a haberdashery, or later, a department store notions counter. You bought yarn alongside buttons, corset lacing, lamp oil, or shoe polish. You weren't browsing for hand-painted merino. You were looking for enough sturdy wool to keep your family from freezing. Craft was domestic labor, necessary skill, economic contribution. Not lifestyle, not identity, and certainly not self-expression. Even during the mid-19th century Victorian pattern explosion, when mass-produced publications began circulating crochet and knitting instructions widely, materials were still purchased in utilitarian spaces. Designers popularized intricate lace through print, and suddenly, patterns were filled with abbreviations and standardized instructions. For more on that, listen to my podcast, Crochet People Part 1. That changed something subtle, but important. The shopkeeper became a translator. Customers didn't just need yarn anymore, they needed clarification. What did that abbreviation mean? How fine was that thread? What hook matched the pattern? But even then, the yarn shop as a cultural gathering place did not yet exist. It was still supply, not sanctuary. By the early 1900s, something begins to shift. We start to see more specialized textile and yarn retailers emerge, particularly in growing towns and cities. One frequently cited example is Heindselman's. Founded in 1904 and often described as the oldest yarn shop in the United States. Now, it's important we say that carefully. Heindselman's is widely cited as the oldest yarn shop in America based on documented founding dates and repeated reporting, not a centralized registry of yarn stores. What we can say with confidence is that it has operated for over a century and was family run for 3 generations, with an ownership transition reported around 2023. Its longevity tells us something important. By the early 20th century, there was already enough demand to sustain yarn specialization. That is significant. It means fiber was becoming a retail category in its own right. But culturally, yarn buying was still largely practical. The true transition hadn't happened yet. After World War II, craft culture shifts again. Knitting and crochet move from economic necessity towards hobby and identity. Synthetic yarns expand, pattern magazines flourish, suburban life reshapes domestic rhythms. Craft becomes something you do in your leisure time, not just to clothe your family, but to express taste, thrift, or creativity. But yarn retail is still largely department store based or mail order. Specialty yarn shops exist, but they aren't yet widespread cultural hubs. The modern LYS as a community space hasn't fully formed. Now let's move to New York City. School Products was established in 1947 and is widely described as the oldest yarn store in New York. Located in the garment district, it historically supplied both hand knitters and machine knitters, serving not just hobbyists, but the professional garment trade ecosystem. And this matters because it shows us that mid-century yarn retail wasn't just domestic, it was industrial. Urban yarn stores functioned as supply nodes within larger fashion and manufacturing networks. They supported designers, factories, sample makers, and production knitters. The LYS model didn't evolve only from hobby culture, it also evolved from textile infrastructure. One branch grows out of domestic craft, another grows out of industrial garment production. Both branches eventually braid together into what we now recognize as the modern LYS. But the true cultural pivot comes in the 1970s. The Back to the Land movement, the natural fiber revival, craft as feminist reclamation, handmade as self-expression. And this is when the local yarn shop begins to emerge in its modern form. Not just a supply counter, not just an industrial distributor, but a creative gathering space. A place to learn, a place to experiment, a place where fiber is identity. That's the moment the LYS stops being only retail and starts becoming culture. If the 1970s gave the LYS its soul, the late 1990s and early 2000s gave it its flair. Before this era, most yarn was big brand, reliable, consistent, predictable. Then came the indie dyers. Small batch colorways, hand-dyed skeins, variegation that looked like watercolor paintings. Suddenly, yarn wasn't just material. It was art. And this changed the economic ecosystem of the LYS forever. Instead of competing on volume, the local yarn shop leaned into curation. The relationship between dyer and shop became symbiotic. Trunk shows became the fiber world's version of a pop-up concert. A dyer would arrive with suitcases of small batch colors, creating festival energy in a 500 square foot shop. Limited quantities, community buzz, shared excitement. The LYS wasn't just selling yarn, it was hosting culture. Then the internet enters the chat. Ravelry launches, fiber blogging explodes, Instagram turns skeins into art galleries, and instead of eliminating LYSs, it transforms them. The shop adopts by becoming something the algorithm cannot be, a filter in a world of infinite choice. In a big box store, you have label literacy. You read the price, the hook size, maybe the fiber content. In an LYS, you develop fiber literacy. You learn how a drape heavy alpaca silk blend will change the geometry of your sweater, why twist direction affects stitch definition, why Icelandic Lopi behaves differently from superwash merino. The LYS becomes a cultural translator, taking global fiber traditions and making them accessible to the local hobbyist. This isn't about snobbery, it's about knowledge. Big box stores increase access, the LYS increases understanding. When we look at the broader history, we can see distinct branches of the same retail lineage. Heindselman's represents longevity and local continuity, a shop that demonstrates early specialization and community roots. School Products represents the industrial branch, tied to garment manufacturing and professional textile infrastructure. Modern indie LYSs represent a third branch, curated community hubs built around creativity, education, and collaboration. These models aren't interchangeable. They're evolutionary cousins, all descended from the same supply counter ancestor. Then came 2020. Lockdowns, canceled stitch nights, no classes, no in person browsing, and shops were forced to pivot fast. E commerce expanded, virtual stitch nights emerged, curbside pickup became normal. Instagram live sales turned into weekly events. Some shops closed, some survived, and communities rallied because people realized something profound. When an LYS closes, you don't just lose inventory, you lose infrastructure, you lose mentorship, you lose accountability, you lose a gathering place, you lose accumulated knowledge. The modern LYS had become too important to quietly disappear. And now, today's shop is retailer, educator, cultural translator, event space, economic hub, community anchor. It exists alongside big chains, outlet marketplaces, and global shipping networks, but it offers something none of these can replicate: relational craft. And that, my friends, is why local yarn stores that are friendly to crocheters matter. The modern yarn shop did not appear overnight. It grew out of supply counters, industrial textile districts, craft revivals, digital revolutions. And today's shops stand at the intersection of all of it. From the haberdashery clerk translating Victorian abbreviations, to garment district suppliers fueling mid-century industry, to 1970s fiber boutiques reclaiming handmade identity, to indie dyers turning skeins into art, to Instagram live sales keeping communities connected during lockdown. This is not just retail evolution, it's cultural evolution. When we hear about the decline of the third place, those spaces outside of home and work where people gather, the coffee shops, the town squares, the libraries. Recent executive actions to dismantle the Institute of Museum and Library Services have led to terminated grants, staff cuts, and shuttered programs. I would argue that, for yarn folk, the local yarn shop is one of the last true third places left. Where else does a 14-year-old who learned to crochet on TikTok sit down beside an 80-year-old who's been stitching since the Truman administration? Where else can you walk in alone and leave known? And when the pandemic forced doors to close, LYSs moved to Zoom, stitching bitches overnight, which, by the way, the term has been used to refer to social stitching groups since at least World War II. But why did all this happen? Because the shop isn't the four walls, it's the community anchor. Which leads me to another yarn shop I used to visit when I lived in Alexandria, Virginia, Fiberspace. The yarn selection, the people who worked there were both great, but I not only purchased yarn from that shop, I was able to sign up for historical walking tours with fellow stitchers who showed up ready to spend several hours walking and learning about history in their knitted or crocheted creations. And people who know me know I love a good walking tour, and those were some of the best. Now, we've seen craft competitions on television, elimination rounds, time limits, dramatic lighting, and camera angles, but the LYS is the antithesis of that model. It's not about elimination, it's about mentorship. It's not about being the best, it's about being better together. The modern yarn shop is a living fiber archive. Every time you walk in, you're participating in a lineage that stretches back millennia, updated with modern colorways, global influences, and a community that has your back whenever you have to frog a stitch. If crochet is a chain of events, the yarn shop is one of its strongest links. So support your local yarn store, because when you support the shop, you support the circle, and the circle is what keeps us stitching. If you have a favorite LYS, shout it out to me in my socials. And please don't forget we at Yarn Over Hook are still working on locating crochet-friendly yarn shops for our colossal yarn crawl of 2026. I'll leave the link for that in the show notes. And speaking of crochet-friendly shops, I recently dragged my little sister along with me as I road tripped in search of several shops in Texas and Louisiana. And we found some great ones. So a quick shout out to Roberta, thanks for the road trip shenanigans, and to Yarning Fiber Arts in Pflugerville, both Gauge Yarn and World Yarns in Austin, the Quilted Skein in LaGrange, Texas, Scout and Skein in Houston, and the Quarter Stitch in New Orleans. If you happen to drop by any of these shops, and I'll leave links for their websites in the show notes, please be sure to tell them that ReRe said hi. And if you're enjoying what you've been hearing, like, subscribe, and share. And once again, thank you so much for listening. This has been Exploration Crochet.